Hello there. Right now I'm just standing among this big pile of... we don't do brand sponsorships, but sometimes it's worth mentioning brands if you feel that they're quite good. So I've got a pile of Regina Blitz. Regina? Is there a correct way? Regina Blitz is just piled around my feet right now because at the very last moment I knocked over my glass of fizzy water just before I was about to start, and I didn't even know. I was so kind of focused on my setup and stuff like that, and then I'm like, my feet are wet, and I look down and there's just this big fizzy puddle around my feet. So I've thrown down all this kitchen roll, and it seems to be soaking it up nicely, but I'm kind of straddling it now like some idiot on the tube. Just because I was having my glass of water by my feet. The glass of water, I don't know why having a glass of water like this. I mean, it's good. Sometimes you just need a bit of refreshment, but it does remind me of those guys on those panel comedy shows who always make a joke and then do the smug little sip of their drink, their smug little sip of water. It's so annoying. So annoying. So they'll say something like, well, I suppose he should have made sure he did that outside the railway carriage. And it's like, I guess it's their way of going, oh, I kind of was making a joke, but in a way I wasn't. I'm just naturally funny, and I'm so insouciant about it. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's just the one that popped into my head. I'm so nonchalant about it that I'm just going to just go about my normal needs for rehydration. When I hosted an open mic at the Poetry Cafe, there was a sort of one of the setups we had when it was before the place was refurbished was that there was a couch near the stage area, and I always felt that the people who kind of sat on the couch, sometimes people just wanted the couch because it was comfortable, but I also felt that the people who sat on the couch kind of wanted to be seen, and sometimes they would do the little heckle, and I kind of allowed heckling because it was not cruel heckling, not like you're heckling, but just sometimes just something that kind of just throws a little something in that makes things a little bit light-hearted, funny, or just even encourages the poet who's reading. But someone would do that as well. I remember some of those guys would do a little heckle, and I watched one of them doing that exact thing, just like, you know, just oh, well, you could have told my mum to do that. And like no one laughed as well, and they still did the sip. I think it's cover. If no one laughs, then it's like, oh, I don't care, I'm rehydrating. But I do remember just thinking, oh, I could just bar you right now. I didn't, but anyway. Which kind of leads me on to what I want to talk about. Hello, my name is Niall. I am a poet who currently writes essays and gives little talks because the muse has abandoned me. And I've just written an essay on my button down about, link in description, about spoken word and the precursor to spoken word performance poetry and what spoken word is now. And I wrote it in... While it's not necessarily like this thing with lots of research and statistics and tons of citations to it, it's still pretty much me just writing from my own recollections and prejudices. It tries to deal with this idea of how the scene has changed, how genres of live performed poetry and live literature have changed, but at the same time how those have been affected often by the mediums that they aim for. And so one big argument in the middle of that essay is that YouTube, I think, had such a massive impact in social media that it actually changed the way in which people performed and the styles that became popular. And I'll get into that. But the first thing I define in it, and one thing I do want to say is that what I said in the essay is that I will make a video talking through this as I am now, talking through these same ideas. But I tried to make the essay a little bit more impersonal, and I felt that maybe when I do this video I could go over some of the same stuff but make it a little bit more personal, a little bit more how it affected me, because ultimately, much like a lot of the people I bumped into in the performance poetry scene of London in the 1990s, it's all about me. But enough about you, let's talk about me. So that was the line that we had for taking the piss out of one particular person who was there were some very, let's just say, egocentric people, me probably being one of the biggest ones of them at the time as well. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about my moment of blundering into a performance scene. I studied art, but I obviously wasn't going to be an artist. I was working in gardening jobs. I was doing a lot of manual labour and stuff like that, but I still felt the need to be creative. And even when I was an art student, I found that when I wanted to express myself, when something really was kind of bearing down upon me, I would find myself writing in order to express myself, rather than painting or making a little video or doing a giant bronze sculpture, just to kind of sum up how I was feeling in that particular moment. I decided I realised that was the direction I was going in, and of course, like a lot of young men at my age at that time, I was reading a lot of Charles Bukowski, and I think one thing I liked about Charles Bukowski is the promise that, hey, you could be doing these manual jobs and all this kind of stuff, but you could still become a big shot writer at the same time after doing a rubbish job for years and years and years, just like Charles Bukowski and just like Charles Bukowski. And so, yeah, you know, I wasn't good with data sets back then. I think people are still that way. They always sort of go, well, that person, they're doing great, aren't they? So I can do great. Okay, are they part of a lot of people that are doing great with that strategy, or are they just one person that got really, 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 really lucky? If that's the case, maybe keep your eggs out of that particular basket. That's the talk someone should have had with me at the time. So I was reading Bukowski, and so, God, for better and for much worse, that influenced a lot of my work. That said, I'd found the work of Fred Voss as well, who actually is a poet who kept on working in, I think he's only retired recently, but he was a poet who worked in machine shops in California, mainly wrote about his job and the people he worked with. And I think there's something to that, having a kind of job and the way that you intersect with elements of society as part of that job, and the way that you just see things that other people don't see sometimes in your work. I think that's an interesting thing to write about, and I think that was obviously the work that people ended up liking of mine, and I think the stuff that allowed me to leave that job about 7 years after I did my first open mic was the fact that I kind of wrote about blue collar life, and there weren't a lot of poets on the scene writing about that because they all had like nicer jobs than me. So that was my way in. That said, I was also reading a lot of Allen Ginsberg at the time, and so yeah, I was and William Blake, and so at the same time I was trying to channel all this kind of Ginsbergian, Blakeian kind of energy into things. There was no YouTube at the time, obviously. It was 1997. And so the performance poetry scene was a big thing. And I think there was a big divide between the literary poetry world and the performance poetry world. The literary poetry world was very kind of quite dry, academic, white, very male. Now, the first kind of striding for equality was definitely kind of gender equality in the traditional sense within the literary scene. But even up until the mid-2000s, you'd get a shortlist for a prize, and it would be all white men, and the first response would be something like, "It's an all-male shortlist. Oh my goodness, it's an all-male shortlist. You need to sort this out." And there would be judges, like you find out the judges were one man and two women, and they would say stuff like, "We chose on merit. We chose on merit." Yeah, I won't go into that particular that particular pack of I don't know, rabid wrestling pigs in barbed wire, and I'll just instead say that it was always interesting because when people would call out the all male shortlist, as they should, but at the same time it was all white people as well, and so it would be a kind of a case of, "Oh, I don't like this shortlist. What don't you like about it?" "Well, it's all male." That's true. And all male? Is that enough? They're all wearing tweed. So there was this sense of a deliberate blind spot about ethnic equality across the board in literary poetry. And I think one of the particular giveaways is a former editor of the Poetry Review, and I'm not going to go into beef with people. I don't really have beef with anyone right now, unless they've been violent to other people in the particular scene I move in, or other forms of just kind of nastiness. But you know, I've set my bar just a lot lower for ending beefs. So anyway, this editor, they were interviewed by a magazine, and I guess they broached the idea about the inequality, the racial inequality within literary poetry, especially within the poetry that they were publishing. And they did say the line, "Oh, it's such a shame that Black and Asian poets are heading into performance and not writing the kind of stuff that we want to publish." Talking, a real pilot hand washing gesture, and but that was the attitude. So at the same time, the diversity was kind of headed. It was just almost accepted. Oh, that's just this white middle-aged academic scene, and here's the scene where all the exciting stuff is and where all the diversity is. And so that did seem to be what was happening. So in that sense, that editor of the Poetry Review wasn't necessarily wrong, but they were talking about it as if it wasn't something that they were part of the cause of. So 1990s, diverse performance poetry scene, working class poets, Black and Asian poets, and many other kind of points of view being expressed. But stylistically, because the literary poetry scene also was quite buttoned up, I mean, it was just always trying to avoid using declarative language. Now, Penguin would still publish something like Linton Kwesi Johnson, mainly because he'd be a poet that had such a massive audience. Why would you not want to publish him? But declarative language was almost frowned upon. There was a show don't tell mentality that sometimes still goes on. Just to put this one to bed, show don't tell is not. It's fine for like maybe a work of fiction where you're saying Johnny was angry or something like that, and maybe you write something like Johnny's face reddened, which to be fair is still rubbish. But you get the point. It's kind of you're demonstrating what's happening rather than telling everyone that Johnny was angry. But that would kind of be transferred over to declarative language within poetry, and I think that's just it's just silly. Like, for instance, you can have declarative language, but it's maybe the thing that makes it interesting is the voice, the tone of the speaker. For instance, maybe there's aspects of the speaker that we don't know if we identify them with the poet or not. Maybe there's ambiguities within the speaker's voice. Maybe there's something about their personality and their history that comes through in their voice while they use this declarative language. So that's fine. But they seem to be avoiding any kind of declarative language in the literary poetry scene in the UK. So again, performance poetry scene, super declarative. Now, because of that stylistic shift, performance poetry really was very theatrical. And it was theatrical because the primary medium of performance poetry was the stage. So, and I was part of this. Can I just say now, because we'll talk about the impact of YouTube and social media on what happened. But again, to get a little bit more personal, I'm thinking back to the stuff I was doing back then, and it was awful. It really was awful, especially those first few years. And I can understand why people just hated me. I think people genuinely hated me. And I can see why, because I was very full of myself, and I was super... just one of those people that obviously couldn't write very well, and I was trying to make up for that by being a very elaborate and dramatic and quite aggressive performer. I punch myself in the head and stuff like that sometimes, and scream and yell and stamp about, and sometimes people just loved it because that's what they want. It's cathartic to watch someone doing that, and other people were just like, when's this going to stop? So, and then it's funny because I kind of definitely turned into the kind of poet that would also look at the poets that did that and go, including a young man he'd always try trashing the stage at the poetry cafe, like crashing into things and stuff, and I'd always say, mate, can you stop, and then he'd go, okay, and then he'd go upstairs and kind of say to everyone, man, what's wrong with him, man, I'm trying to express myself. And it's like, express yourself but break your own stuff, mate. So anyway, back to it. Very theatrical, including me, and I'm very glad that even though I think I was videoed a few times, I'm very glad that I'm not. I don't know. I'm just very glad that I'm not. That the recordings haven't survived. I'm hoping that they've kind of rotted away, like that man in like Julian Glover's character at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Spoilers. I just hope that those tapes have just crumbled to dust, and they can just live on in the memories of people who thought I was awful at the time. So yeah, I'm glad there's no videos of that time. But again, very theatrical. And now there's a video that I think really works very well as a time capsule for performance poetry, and that's Acronym by Atomic Lip. And I think it's been Joel Taylor, who's one of Atomic Lip, as with Patience Agbarbi and Steve Tassane, and Speech Painter as well. They're all doing their thing. Steve Tassane's still kind of on a poetry scene. He's writing children's novels and stuff as well. Joelle Taylor has been super successful, won a T.S. Eliot Prize, just brought out her debut novel. Similarly, Patience Agbarbi, I think it's one of the next generation poets as well. And last thing I heard about Speech Painter is that he's like, I think I met him, I chatted to him, and he repairs watches now. He's like, works in a watch shop, which is cooler than just everything else, isn't it? So they're doing great. But there's this video, Acronym. I'm really grateful that it's been uploaded. I teach a module about poetry and performance and spoken word at London Metropolitan University, and I teach the normal poetry module there as well. And normal poetry, he says, oh my God, that's a giveaway. So, but I like showing that video every now and again. And the students do kind of cringe when they react to it. But part of the point of this module is that we watch lots of videos that could end up being cringy, like the first wave of slammers can be a bit like that as well. But why is it cringy? Because no one was like cringing at the time. People liked it at the time. And so normally it's a shift in values, but a shift in our attitudes towards the mediums as well. So performance poetry, primary place for it was the stage. Now, secondary to the stage was television. If you wanted to know what was happening in the London poetry scene in the late 90s, you didn't necessarily go on the internet. There was no social media as well, obviously. You would go on Time Out and there would be a few strips of a few columns at the end of the book section telling you what was happening in London that week. And so that's and then you'd make your plan as to where to go. But you would also see, just little things. It's so funny. It'd be great seeing your name in Time Out. I remember that. Be like, yes, my name is in Time Out. And sometimes you look at your name on the bill as well, like how far up the list were you. That was all interesting. So back to Atomic Lip, about that performance. Again, very theatrical. The second medium was television. So you can tell from this Atomic Lip video, when you compare it to a later spoken word video, is it's been recorded, I think, to be televised or projected. So you could imagine that the natural setting is either a living room with people sitting there, and there's distance between the screen and the viewers as well. It's not this kind of immediate, intense thing that they're plugged into. And also it's a bit more social. There are people normally watching together. I know people watch telly on their own. And it did strike me as something that was probably made for either broadcast at some kind of maybe film festival type thing, or something that was made, projected at an arts festival, or maybe broadcast. Like they would have this later hours on TV in the 90s when you'd be getting in a bit off your boat on whatever, and you would turn the telly on and there would just be weird stuff on the telly, and I think that would fit in there. So yeah. I'm saying this about Atomic Lip because I think it gets some stick. And when we talk about whether something has aged gracefully or not gracefully, so like that performance, well, whichever way, if time has not been kind to it, then we can be kind to it and we can appraise it in an open way. That's how I feel about it right now. And I'm one of those people that used to look at it many, many years ago and go, oh my God, it's the performance poetry scene. But now I think it's quite a good insight. It doesn't necessarily faithfully portray what was happening on stages, but it gives an idea of how almost violently it contrasts with the kind of stuff that's around today. So performance poetry, very theatrical, and television was the second medium. I think poets, like people used to get people into their open mics. Like if they felt that they weren't going to get a good attendance, they'd always say, oh, there's some producers from Channel 4 coming in. And then like loads of people would come in because they wanted to get on telly. I think because they felt this idea that if they'd be broadcast on telly, they would like get more work, bring in more audiences and stuff like that. And people were kind of making a bit of money from the scene as well. There were lots of nights running every night, and a lot of these nights, if they had you as a feature, you'd normally get a cut of the door, and it might be something like 30 quid, 15 quid normally. But back then, that would actually kind of at least pay for your night out, weirdly enough. So, oh, I hate these little awkward gaps. I'm really trying to avoid jump cuts right now. So yeah, theatrical, televisual. Televisual because at the time, also in the late 90s, there was a poet, he's still around, Murray Lachlan Young, and he got a lot of publicity because he got signed to a record label, according to the reports, for £1 million, and he ended up on the news and in the newspapers. And then he had his own BBC special as well. And it was really interesting that that's the narrative that they had to come at it with. Oh, he's the £1 million poet. And that led lots of other people to think, oh, maybe I'll make £1 million as well. Oh, one more thing about the theatricality of the performance poetry scene, and I did not put this in the essay. I have written it elsewhere, which is, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but actors, who were looking to get an equity card, and they had to include paid work for their equity card. Actors were able, until a certain point, to include poetry gigs as evidence of paid work so that they could join equity. So a lot of actors came onto the scene, and then they stopped that, and then there were fewer actors, so again, less theatrical. Don't know if that's true, because I think there's another reason why things became less theatrical, and it was because of the change in medium. So let's get to that. So performance poetry is a thing. Now, in between that kind of heyday of performance poetry and the beginning of the genres and styles that we might associate with spoken word, there was kind of a time when a lot of poets, including me actually, were becoming... I was reading a lot. So one thing that's changed and stopped me running around and punching myself in the side of the head and stuff like that, was that I was just reading a lot more, and that literary poetry, the good stuff, I was beginning to go, oh right, wow, how can I include this in what I do? So I was becoming more of a hybrid artist. But other poets such as Tim Wells and Tim Turnbull, who kind of, some of them come back from the older ranting days of poetry, were also writing work that was getting published by Donut Press, and their work was nominated for the Ford Prize, for the best first collection, Nord Prize, and I think Tishani Doshi won that year. And so there was more hybridization happening, I think. But there are other brilliant performance poets as well, people who are perhaps already beginning to branch into spoken word, like Zena Edwards, who's still going, and Selena Godden, who's still going, and David J, who I've not seen for ages. And David J was a kind of a rap poet, again, pre-spoken word in a way, but really good, a really, really, really talented performer. I still don't think anyone can touch him, including K Tempest. I just think, from what I've seen, the skill that he had, a lot of it was this kind of conspiracy theory stuff, a bit like Cool Keith, Dr. Octagon, and even like William Burroughs, but it really worked. It really worked. Now, I've not seen him for a while, so I hope the pugilist is doing all right. But genuinely, he was up there. I think I'd always say he's the best for me as a performer. But there was hybrid stuff happening too, and I was kind of happy about that, because I didn't like the page-stage divide. I felt that all the interesting stuff was happening in the middle. There were also, this is by about the mid-2000s, a lot of festivals like Latitude and Glastonbury, who were kind of bringing poets together on the stage, and there were performers and there were literary poets too. And I always felt the literary poets felt that maybe they had to up their game, and they had to, because the performers were just selling more product than them perhaps. And on the other hand of things, I think the performers were noticing how tight the writing was from the literary poets, and realised, you know what, if you're reciting a piece of writing, yes, you can kind of cover up the inadequacies of that writing by, I don't know, shouting and punching yourself in the head. Maybe I'll finish the video by doing... No, I won't. So, but if you make your writing tighter, it's like the scaffolding of your performance. You know, it's got sturdier, and it actually allows you more freedom in performance when your writing is good. So there was that as well. So did this great hybrid event happen? No, it didn't. And one reason why was because, I think, social media. So when social media started, everyone had a MySpace page in the poetry scene, and you'd have like 4 excerpts of performances. This was, God, when was this? This would have been around the mid 2000s. And so the idea that suddenly you could, a few more people were getting broadband now as well, like the slowest form of broadband, but enough to stream audio. And you could also allow people to download. So I'd have a MySpace page. I remember this. I did a reading in Berlin for the British Council. So around this time, I was making a living as a poet. I'd just been on a tour with Apples and Snakes as well, and I was doing some educational stuff too. And I recorded this whole thing because I thought, wow, it's an hour-long gig, and I think you had a 15-minute maximum length for each clip. So I just had 4 15-minute clips of my hour-long reading in Berlin. And that was always the stuff I really wanted to do. I think that was the stuff really I was happiest doing, longer readings, where I could talk to the audience. And I felt that I was at my best actually when I'd had 15 minutes to warm up, whereas for most sets around London, the longest I'd read would be about 20 minutes normally, maybe half an hour. And sometimes I felt I'd only be getting warmed up at the end of that half hour or 20 minutes. So that was lovely, but I only got the opportunities to read for that long when I'd kind of go abroad a lot of the time, or get booked for particular gigs that weren't the poetry scene. There were things where I would just be the entertainment for the evening. People actually booked me as the entertainment for the evening at conferences and stuff. I wasn't, imagine if I'd gone and punched myself in the head and shouted at them and stuff like that for an hour. They'd have to kind of just wake me up. Oh, okay, he's conscious again. Okay, carry on. Right. Sorry, that was a bad joke, so I'm just going to go put that over here. So that's another pause. Don't mind. No jump cuts. I'm avoiding the jump cuts. Gen Z and all you, I know you all love your jump cuts, but I'm Gen X, and I quite like the little modulations of the odd awkward silence in my content. So we had our MySpace pages, but the MySpace pages and YouTube a little bit later on, it really was just about recording and documenting our performances. It was still a stage medium. I think even TV still had that clout as well. So there were a few documentaries still happening and people kind of wanted to be involved in those. That said, I think things were changing. So as I said, people were just recording performances. The quality obviously would be terrible. And this was an interesting thing because I don't think the BBC or any of the documentary makers, I don't think any of them, when they did, and there were so many pilots that were filmed that never amounted to anything. But I often found, but there's some radio shows like Bespoken Word and a few others, and they always had the same problems. So they had the production values, but it was very staged. I don't mean staged, obviously everything's staged in a performance scene. You could tell the audience had been drilled to kind of overreact to everything, and that everyone was just like, poetry, yeah! Which, if I'm a casual, I don't want anything. I don't want any of that. I want something that's going to draw me in. And so the videos that were taken of performances, live performances, I felt captured the scene more than what those TV shows and radio shows did after a producer had got their dirty mitts on it and tried to make it more of a television medium, while ultimately killing that vital spark that was still present on stage. And the stage stuff was recorded, but the sound would be awful. I mean, God, some of the stuff I uploaded to this very channel was really bad. Really bad. It might have been a great performance, but it would be like the lighting was so terrible you couldn't see me. There would just be some shadow. And you could just about hear what I was saying, but lots of ambient noise. And I would upload that thinking, well, it was a good performance, not thinking, no one's going to watch that. So this is, but we didn't have the means of a BBC production crew. And the BBC production crew were too busy thinking about making a television programme, which is their job, but not thinking about what it was about the scene that worked and what they needed to kind of bring onto the stage. And I think all they had to do was just use decent equipment to record things in a more naturalistic way. I think Def Poetry Jam, I think also had that kind of slightly over-rehearsed quality and way too bloody earnest as well. But I'm going to jump over to button poetry because this is a precursor as to why a certain stylistic change happened in the UK, but I didn't notice it happening in the US spoken word scene. And so button poetry, I think they did record really good quality performances, but the recordings were good, the sound was good, and they did that thing that the TV producers should have done, which is just capture what was happening, but make sure it's just well lit, and that the audio is good. That's all you have to do, and just get out of the way with all your producer pretensions. And I know it was good because you had videos like Neil Hilborn's OCD getting 12 million views. And so this is the thing now. So I think because of that, the thing that crept into spoken word into the UK, or the development that happened in spoken word in the UK, didn't necessarily happen in the US, because when it was time to kind of jump into social media in the US and YouTube, the quality was there, and there wasn't a producer trying to kind of turn it into something that it wasn't. So we go over to the UK, and like, no one's getting 12 million views. I think maybe you've got Sully Breaks and George the Poet, and this is a kind of later generation of spoken word, and their stuff's quite cinematic, so it's not necessarily a performance, but it's almost like a music video, and that's because of like the kind of YouTube channels that were happening. So there were a lot of, I've forgotten the name of it. There's one particular channel, the young lad who was the entrepreneur who made it. He died recently, and I've forgotten the name of the channel, but I know that's where George Poet and Sully Breaks came from, and it was almost a sort of like an MTV channel, like a music video channel, but it had that culture of kind of grime and UK sort of inner city culture, and then they had the poetry, the spoken word. And so that's why the style of it was a lot like music videos. There'd be music in the background, they'd be performing, and it would have those production values. Now, the other stuff that got millions of views wasn't necessarily performance. Again, stuff recorded on the stage with bad equipment. It was recorded with not great equipment, but it really worked. And that was stuff like Holly McNish, Mathematics, which I think got 2 million views. And while Mark Grist recorded a version of his poem "A Girl Who Reads," which I used to love showing to my students in a poetry and feminism class because it would provoke debate, but I don't do that anymore. That is "A Girl Who Reads." Yes, there was a cinematic version which got millions of views, but he did another version where it wasn't even his channel, it's someone else's channel, where someone just got him to perform it over a table, like a cafe table, and it got 250,000 views. So this was doing better than the stuff recorded in performance venues with bad sound or whatever, and whatever the BBC were trying to do, or Sky Arts with performance poetry and spoken word. But it was these videos of, so Holly McNish's video, it's just her looking at a webcam. I think she's just got a lamp pointed at her face, not like this very high-tech arrangement I have here. I've got a lamp pointed at my face here. But it was also, so that's the stuff that did well, and that's where I think we start to see this new style of poetry performance, which is more personable and conversationable and just a bit more chilled. There's no more "I'm a performance." There's no more like, Holly McNish, believe it or not, didn't start screaming and punching herself in the head just to kind of give the video, just to make sure she was getting everyone's attention. She didn't need to do that. How does she get everyone's attention? By just being Holly and performing her poem in a conversational. So yeah, the poem rhymes. It's still got this kind of spoken word, almost hip-hop influenced cadence to it. But at the same time, it's just this, it's a person that you would like to have a cup of tea with and have a little chat with, giving you their poem about racism and migration and how much migrant communities have enriched society. And she's talking to you like a fellow human being and an equal. And that's what people connected with. When you're watching a video of someone performing, and there's the audience and there's the ambient noise and it's not been filmed very well, and even the poet's voice is also for a microphone, which kind of puts that amplified sound of their voice through a speaker, puts another layer, of separation between you and the piece. So I think that's. But also I think poets were recording on their webcams and stuff, because you would still, if I did a poem to a webcam on a laptop, the sound wouldn't be great, the film, the visuals wouldn't be great, but it would still be better than the piece filmed on a potato at a live gig, because it's taken away so many factors that make it so uncomfortable. But also I think when you record a video, it's no longer about a big audience, the person on the stage, or even the person on the screen, like a television screen. Going back to the atomic lip thing, which I'll mention again in a second, it's someone who's just talking it's there's not much distance. You know what I mean? It's if you're watching it on a phone or an iPad or something like that, it's right there in front of your face, and you're just having this and the way that people interface with computers is different to the way people or phones is different to the way they interface with a television screen. Which again, there's distance, there's more space. That's why I think that when people watched that Atomic Lip video and they had that just right up to your face intimacy that you have with a device, the way that you kind of vanish into this world, and then you've got these poets who are just very lively in your face and stuff like that. I think when you're watching it in that context rather than on a television or on a projected screen, it's right up against you and you're just, you know, it's too much. It's information overload, and I think that's why people reacted the way they did. So the spoken word is more personable. Now it's getting millions of views, and here's the metrics. So if I'm booking gigs, people were just performing videos in order to get more live gigs, get more sets, stuff like that. And so promoters, now there's a metric. There wasn't a metric before. Apart from butts on seats, maybe winning a slam, stuff like that, maybe being on television and having a few people know about you. That was the metrics before in the performance poetry scene. But now it's just this number under a bloody video. You know, there's a number, that many people watched it, that many people liked it. It's brutal in its own way, but that's the new world we were in. And so promoters started booking that. So that affected what was happening on stage. And so the stuff that happens on stage becomes very personable. So, for instance, a lot of slam performances, even like stuff in a roundhouse slam, if you watch the videos. Now, America, as I said, America never took this route. So when you watch the kind of university slam videos on the American sites like Button Poetry, everyone's still kind of angry and everyone's still doing the performance thing. But it's just a really well filmed and well recorded stage performance. But I think when you watch the UK slam things, it's got that quieter style. Often when a poet begins, the poet will just kind of look at the audience and they'd almost have this like intense moment of eye contact, and then they would say, "You said it was over." They'd step to the mic and they'd say something like that. "We've been in the car for 2 hours today, but we haven't spoken a word. You're watching the birds flying about." I'm just improvising anyway, but you get the point. It's just that. So it's not like, "Oh, I'm in your face, I'm a performer, I punch myself in the..." It's no. Again, they're not punching themselves inside the head. If they do, maybe it's just a little like that. I don't know. But it's chilled, it's personable, because it's the kind of stuff that does well on YouTube. And I think it really changed the style. And so there was immediately this clash of values between the older performance poets who kind of felt that, I think, the last generation, they thought that things were getting boring, tame, bourgeois. And this didn't help that that kind of style, again, someone talking very intimately in a way that almost gets a viewer to kind of feel, "Oh my God, I'm in this moment with you. We're connecting." Advertisers saw that, wanted a piece of it right away. Advertisers don't want people shouting about, you know, a building society to you. You know what I mean? Like you know, lower interest on your first home payment. They don't want that. There was a little moment of John Cooper Clarke and Honey Monster collaboration. By all accounts, John Cooper Clarke was deeply off his face, and I just can't imagine what kind of experience those adverts might have been for him. But advertisers is suddenly someone can talk to and they can use rhyme, because advertisers love rhyme. American poets abandoned rhyme, and then kind of hip hop cadences kind of brought it back a little bit. But English poets never, British poets, sorry, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, British poets never really abandoned rhyme. I think often, and advertisers never abandoned rhyme, because rhyme is the ultimate brain worm, ultimate way of putting little worms and feelers inside someone's skull. So, and a lot of the spoken word poets still use rhyme as well, often those kind of internal rhymes that you might find in hip hop too. Not always, but most of the time. Advertisers love this. So, a bunch of poets got commissioned by a building society to do these, including Holly McNish actually, and I think Holly McNish is even just there with a cup of tea, chatting to you. And you know, ethics aside, building societies, they're not as evil as banks. You know, as far as I know, they're owned, aren't they? Are they owned by their by the people that bank with them? I can't remember. Anyway, I know ethical banking is kind of an oxymoron, but there we go. So they're doing this piece, and of course, the other thing about that generation of performance poets is they're political. I think both generations are political, but the older generation are very much in that don't sell out political mindset. Whereas the spoken word poets were a bit more like, you know what? I've just written a piece and it's not my best piece, but it's being broadcast during the advert break on X Factor. It's bringing eyes to me and it's bringing eyes to my scene. And so I think there was that sort of little bit of trust that the poets had. And you know what? They got paid. Someone made so much money. I remember if they used your piece and your recording of it, you would make a good amount of money. Probably enough to live on for a year for your average poet who's learned to not live on a lot. So that would buy you a year of creative autonomy. George the poet, who I mentioned before with his cinematic stuff, he's done a lot of adverts, and I've got to say his adverts are the kind of an old Gen Xer like me when I'm watching someone advertising Jeeps and going, you're not part of the production line. And the Coca-Cola after the pandemic advert he did as well, which just, again, kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But I don't judge George by his commissions. I don't judge many poets by their commissions. I judge him by what he does that I could tell he's putting his heart into, and that's his podcast. And his podcast is amazing. It's really, really good. I'll get onto podcasts in a minute, although I probably am running really low on time now. So I don't know how long I've been talking for. So let's see if I can try and steer this in. If there's anything else to say, I can say it next time. So, there was that kind of schism, I think, between the kind of Gen Xer poets and then the millennial spoken word poets. Now, I guess I'm going to fast forward. I hate that term, fast forward today. It's so lazy. It's the verbal equivalent of that record scratch sound effect in the middle of a comedy trailer. But when we look now, and I don't mention names, but when I look at all the spoken word channels and stuff like that, a lot of them aren't getting millions of views anymore. So actually, let's look at Button Poetry. And I understand Button Poetry are probably working with a fair bit of funding and stuff like that. They probably are a charity now, maybe. I don't know. I know nothing about them. Their videos aren't getting 12 million views anymore. And that's fine. It's probably just part of... They're working with a lot of young poets that don't have a big name, and they're trying to push their work up and uplift them. So yeah, it's not going to get necessarily millions of views, but it might help that poet out. I get it. But I just felt that as it manifests online, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be getting those big views anymore. Now we're about sort of 10 to 15 years later, 14 years later. We're not at 2025 yet, Niall. But what they are doing is so. But one thing I have noticed, I'm mumbling, is that stylistically a lot of spoken word hasn't moved on. I don't feel like there's some great kind of stylistic innovation happening, and I'm almost whereas I do feel that shift into that more conversational, personable thing was definitely a stylistic innovation, much like the performance poetry of my time was probably an innovation too, when things probably that comes from stuff like punk gigs and raves and things like that affecting it. So the medium, that's the big argument that's threaded through this whole thing. The mediums of the time will always dictate the kind of work that's created. So what are the mediums now? Well, there's TikTok. I went on TikTok to research for the essay, and I watched some spoken word stuff. And again, I don't like being a meanie pants about other people's work. I'll just say it wasn't for me. Okay, but that's stuff that's getting millions of views. But a million views on TikTok is not the same as a million views on YouTube. It's kind of, because TikTok viewing is a bit more passive. Even YouTube itself, which has shorts and then the normal videos, and as a monetization guideline, I think you need to have. So if you want to monetize your channel, you need 3,000 hours of viewing within a year for normal videos, and then for the shorts, you need 3 million views. So they're not really, the forms themselves are not equivalent. So you might look at a TikTok video and go, oh my God, this person got 3 million views, but it's not really having that same impact as a 3 million views on a YouTube video has. I sound like an old man now, but you know what I mean. So anyway, I've watched it. I think I'll keep an eye on it. That's all I'm going to say, the TikTok stuff. I don't think it's hit its maturity yet. I think people are kind of, it's people are doing great, obviously, so more power to them, but I don't feel there's any kind of innovation that's happened yet. Where is the innovation? Well, here's the thing. Yes, poets were getting 2 million views or whatever, 12 million views about 10 years ago. It's not really happening now. YouTube and other social media stopped being the means towards a greater performance career, and it became the end within itself. So young people of a certain generation didn't want to be pop singers. They wanted to be YouTubers, for instance. The kids, when you ask kids, it's like basketball player, doctor, YouTuber. That would be the triad rather than maybe movie actor or something like that. So I think that emphasis changed, and people just to go on to, so now you have commentary channels, you have video essays, and I just think people aren't necessarily kind of writing this thing first. Do you know what I mean? They're not like writing a poem. I think audiences, the thing that worked about some of these spoken word videos, that intimacy, that candidness, you know what, you take the poem away and now you can just you can just intensify that even more. I think people like something that feels improvised and not rehearsed, for instance. Now, this is certainly not a diss on the spoken word poets, because I said many of them, they're still like Holly McNish, touring, doing very well on Instagram. That's more her medium now. Kay Tempest just had a performance. They just had a documentary on the BBC, and they're doing great with their music and their books, proper polymath. The people that came up, I think, are still doing well, but the scene itself, not so much. Another thing we have to say about the spoken word scene is that we had a pandemic, and that pushed people into video as well. And I think all these live performance venues, such as the Poetry Cafe, where I started off, that's my second ever gig, or my second ever reading at the open mic, and then I ran that open mic for 15 years. Poetry Cafe closed 4 years ago. By the way, this is very London centric. I always have to remind myself, just because something isn't big in London doesn't mean it's not big elsewhere. So there could be people watching this in Bristol, in Liverpool, in Edinburgh, thinking, what the hell are you on about, mate? Things are buzzing. And you're probably, you're right. I'm wrong, definitely here. I'm just going from my little parochial London village way of seeing things. So, but the scene never really recovered, especially the smaller venues. And I think some venues are still running. You still get Apples and Snakes running Jaw Dance. You've got Outspoken, which isn't really a spoken word night now. It's more literary poets that are good at reading their work. And that's the other thing. The other thing that happened was the literary scene. There was a report in 2010 called the Free Verse Report. And what happened was that they took a sample of all these publishers, and they saw that 1% of the people being published by the mainstream publishers were from Black and Asian backgrounds. 1%. And so this caused a bit of a kerfuffle. And as much as I wanted the outcome to be to just burn the establishment to the ground and just give all that funding to publishers like the one I was editing for, still edit for, Flip Tie, and just to give these smaller publishers that were diverse, to give them all the money and all the attention, the emphasis was, and I get why they did it. It's just me being a Gen Xer, tear it all down type person, shouting, punching myself in the head, and that is just that they instead moved to do something to rehabilitate. So they did something called the Complete Works, and poets such as Malika Booker, Roger Robinson, Warson Shire, Inua Ellams, Kayo Chingonyi. I know I'm missing out loads, but lots of poets came up through that. Nick McCullough, and have done very well for themselves since, and they're getting published by the mainstream publishers, and they're being nominated and sometimes winning the mainstream prizes. At first, the mainstream poetry world, and I caught a bit of flack for this because I called it out on Twitter. It wasn't so much a call out, I tried to be nice about it, which is that the mainstream poetry world in the UK were publishing poets from the US, such as Claudia Rankine and Denez Smith, and that's great because they're poets you should read. I mean, Claudia Rankine is still one of my favourites. she really influences my style of writing in the sense of I kind of want to write something that's between an essay and a poem, and sometimes it just ends up being one or the other. But I like the road the way that she walks between the critical and the lyrical. So it's not about the quality of these poets. They were already very successful in the United States, and I felt that UK publishers weren't doing enough to bring up and empower Black and Asian poets from the UK. I think it's easier to diversify your list by finding poets that have been very successful elsewhere, when other people have invested in those poets. And so I put it a very nice way, which is, I love these poets, but it'd be great to see us bringing up poets from the UK. And people kind of unfortunately didn't see what it was, which was an attack on the UK poetry mainstream, and especially the prizes and the publishers. And they saw it as an attack on those poets instead, or an attack on American poets, which was not the point of it. Anyway, let it go, Niall, let it go. Incidentally, around the time of the performance poetry to spoken word shift, I wrote another piece called Remembering the Death of Performance Poetry, and that annoyed a lot of people as well. Hello, Attila the stockbroker. How you doing, mate? So let's get back to what's happening now. So yes, I think the kids are becoming YouTubers and stuff like that instead. And I think some of the innovation, I've seen it elsewhere. And I think the pandemic also has had its effect in just the coup de grace, basically the bullet in the back of the head for a lot of performance poetry and live poetry elements within London, at least. But I think the innovation is happening, and this is the little point of hope that I want to end this on. And yes, it is finally coming to an end. So podcasts, amazing. I talked about Georgia Poets podcast, but Imaginary Advice, Ross Sutherland, Dave and Lizzie Turner's You Don't Know. I think podcast has been a really interesting medium of mixing poetry with experimentation. And I think it's been a lot more experimentation than the kind of spoken word scene. So it's still intimate, but it's just doing different things. Dare I say, it's more like performance art in some ways, but performance art in a way that doesn't, the drill. So that's happening. And then I look at video essays. Now, the first wave of video essays, and I do love like Dan Olson, Folding Ideas, Lindsay Ellis, but they are actually no. Lindsay Ellis is still very personable. Actually, so I think not necessarily her, but you can see with the video essays, there's almost two kinds. There's the stuff that feels like a TV documentary, but enjoying the freedoms that a TV documentary producer wouldn't allow you. Like Dan Olson stuff, where he can get very deep and intense and into things, but his style of delivery is almost like a documentary presenter on a television show. Whereas people like CJDX and either Dredge or Greg, I can't remember how to pronounce the channel's name, and a few others, these Gen Zers. I think the millennials did the kind of documentarian style video essays, but the Gen Zers, theirs is again a bit more performative. It's really interesting. And now all of a sudden, especially with CJDX, I think they are amazing. I'm a massive fan of everything they do, and you should check them out. But CJDX is almost borrowing some of that performance poetry energy from back in the day, but they're marrying it with this philosophical and quite intellectually heavy, while same time funny and entertaining form of video essay. And so that's a really interesting avenue, and that's where I can see performance coming back. And even this, look, I'm doing this video here, and I'm really enjoying doing these videos, and I'm really enjoying the just talk for a while without jump cuts way of doing this thing. No one would let me do this on a stage. If you spoke too much between poems at a poetry gig, and I guess people went to see poets, but people would get annoyed. But sometimes, every now and again, I'd see someone, probably me as well, who was a better talker than they were a poet. And sometimes I kind of thought, in a way, I just want to listen to them talk, but they have to punctuate it with poems instead. So I enjoy this. This isn't new, by the way. Obviously, someone talking to a camera for an hour on social media and on YouTube is not new. But David Antin, I'll talk about him another time, but there was a guy who actually went up on stage and would talk through ideas and then call it poetry rather than actually going, and my next poem is. So there's definitely he's been doing that. He died in 2000 and I can't remember, was it 2000? I don't. In the 2010s, he died, but he'd been doing it since I think the 60s, 70s. So, back to this. Interesting thing is there's an interview I found with Greg and CJ the X, and they're chatting, and they're both rebelling against the kind of online component. And CJ the X, they're going to go on a tour, and part of the theme of that tour is to kill the internet, to try and bring what they do in these videos and what's popularized them within these videos into a live setting with a live audience. And there'll be much discouraging of using phones as well and stuff like that. Oh, incidentally, that's nothing I noticed that was different about the performance, about the spoken word scene, which is everyone's taking photographs and they're on their phones. And, well, I didn't like that unplugged because I felt there was a safety thing. People didn't want to be recorded without permission. But I noticed that actually people would just live tweet the events and stuff like that. And it was, again, that's a different generational thing going on there. I'm going back to what I'm meant to be finishing, so I'm going to finish. So the thing with Greg and CJDX is that Greg's going on about community as well. Going on, that sounds a bit critical, but it's not. But it seems that these Gen Z video essayists who are more kind of performance art in their style than documentarian are hungering for that feeling of the stage and that live connection. And if I was to be a guy, and I'm continuously wrong, any poet that's got really big, especially from the performance scene in the past 10-15 years, I always saw it after everyone else. Oh yeah, after they got big. Oh yeah, of course. But I was rubbish about this kind of thing. But I got a feeling that's where it's going. I think it will be a return to performance, but hopefully it will be just talking, speech. It won't be these rehearsed pieces peppering it. It'll be the thing I always wanted it to be, which is, I'm not saying I'll be able to do this, because I think the precursor in some ways is to kind of get that following online and then jump back into the live thing. But maybe the way forward is something where we have an open mic scene again, where we experiment with talking and stuff like that. And sometimes we might read a poem, but sometimes we might just talk about something for 5 minutes instead. Maybe that's the way forward. I don't know. I don't know why I did a really bad kind of American doing a Scottish accent for that. I don't know, that I was trying to finish off with. But I think it is time to finish. And I realise now that I am just garrulous to a fault. And I hope I've given a sense of how things have developed. And hopefully the things I forgot to write about in the essay are present in this talk. And if you want to read further on it, I think there's lots of stuff I didn't include in this talk that I put in the essay. But I want to end it on that hopeful note. I think you can never hold a human urge down, and the human urge to connect with an audience. And I miss connecting with audiences. I enjoy this, but I really miss being in front of people and looking them in the eye. It's just that I'm not sure I want to do what I did before, which is I didn't mind sort of being funny and whatever for 1 minute between poets while I'm hosting an open mic. But even when I was doing live poetry, I did feel, and I still feel sometimes when I do it, that I'm talking to an audience and I feel like I'm engaged, now I'm interested, this is fun. And then I read this piece that I wrote ages ago or recite it, and it just feels kind of dead coming out of my mouth. The spark that I think is there when I talk like this is missing when I speak something that's been rehearsed. So I'm hoping this will just this will feed back into some kind of live performance. I don't know what. I'll end it there. It's very awkward. Just that's what I've been standing in.